Good morning, everyone. My name is Maureen Elgersman-Lee. I'm the director of the W&M Bray School Lab, and welcome to day 2 of the 2023 Slate Seminar, our conference within a conference, as we like to call it, operating within the 2026 conference. As you know, the theme this year is Contested Freedoms. It's really my pleasure to serve as, it says moderator. I'm going to do some simple introduction, a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'm going to pass the baton to this very capable panel who's going to take it and run with it. We had an amazing day yesterday, and we expect nothing less today. We might even exceed yesterday. We've got great panels. Now, the Bray School's Contested Space, followed by Prioritizing Descendant Voices. We'll break for lunch again downstairs where we had lunch yesterday, and then we will wrap up the day with looking ahead to 2024, the year of the Bray School. So really excited. Thank you for being a Slate Seminar registrant. Thank you for being a friend of the Slate Seminar with Rev Ed and for 2026. This panel is really a special panel because it represents, in many ways, the heart of the operation of the Bray School Lab, and that's students. I'm going to introduce to you starting at the end because that is the order that they'll be speaking. Madeline Dort, who is now a graduate student at William & Bray. She was one of our inaugural student thought partners as an undergrad, so really glad to have her back on the panel working with us in this capacity. Next to her is Nicole Brown, who'll present second. Nicole Brown is a PhD student in American Studies at William & Bray. She's also the Bray School Lab Assistant, incredible scholar in her own right, comes with incredible knowledge base and presence that you will pick up on very soon. She wears other hats with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, helping to get to 2024, particularly with the move to launch and interpret the preserved and unveiled Bray School that will happen next September. Rachel Hogue, another inaugural student thought partner who remains with us at the lab, who has done incredible work around some of the things that you're seeing, textile, hands-on. And Rachel, you've gone on to CW or not? Mm-hmm. Yes, CW. So, but continues to be an incredible partner with us and really helping us to shape programming for next year as well. Got some great ideas. Olivia Blackshire, our most recent addition to the Student Thought Partner team, a credible partner, supporter. She helped us introduce Daniel Black when he was here last month, and also with lunch when he came in April, right? So she's all in, and we love it, and we want her to stay as long as she can stay. So with no further ado, we have the Bray School's Contested Space. I'll save my housekeeping for after the session.
All right, good morning, everyone. So I will be speaking first and kind of presenting a holistic picture about the Bray School as contested space. So on the whole, the Bray School itself, the lab, and the current ongoing construction of the Colonial Williamsburg Living Museum space are in and of themselves contested spaces. We can define contested space as a site of conflict, places of loss, fear, resistance, or pilgrimage, where the materiality of violence forcibly brings the past into the present. Moreover, contested spaces can cause disputes amongst communities. As a student and educator, I find that contested spaces exist everywhere, including in my very own English classroom. Today, I will be sharing my thoughts on the Bray School as contested space in correspondence with my own personal experience navigating the archival silences, and gaps in the historical record within both my undergraduate and graduate work, and also connecting this thinking to my current position as an English teacher here in rural Virginia, New Kent. First, I am honored to share that I have been involved with the Bray School Lab since its creation. My main role is as transcriber, but I've also been involved in the re-recording or recording project of primary documents. Currently, I'm a graduate student at the School of Education at William & Mary, and this spring I graduated with my degree in English and minor in art history. And throughout my undergraduate and graduate experience, I feel as though I have been truly enlightened by critical, analytical thinking and productive discussion leading to powerful conversations across all the courses I have taken here in a variety of subjects. Indeed, the vision of our college is as follows. William & Mary transcends the boundaries between research and teaching, teaching and learning, learning and living. People come to William & Mary wanting to understand and change the world, and together we do. I find this statement to be resoundingly true to my time as a student here, and I'm very grateful for the experiences I've had at the college, and especially here at the Bray School Lab, and I hope to bring what I've learned into my communities moving forward, especially into my English classroom. Specifically in regards to my personal growth as a student and what has drawn me to the archives, during my junior year, I sought out a lab experience after having this greater experience in one of my English courses titled 19th Century African American Women's Diaries, taught by Professor Jennifer Putsey. So in this course, we worked together to transcribe the pages of the 1872 Mary Virginia Montgomery Diary, which is held in the Library of Congress. There are fewer than 10 diaries in the public record of Black women prior to 1900, and in this class, we read 4 of them together. In these diaries, we found detailed accounts of their daily lives, from personal interest to introspection. And from this experience, I wanted to continue to assist in the effort of deep exploration within the archives. From such research, we can bring a strong voice to those not exposed in the archive to the fullest extent possible. This idea of archival silences, or the phrase in the gaps in the historical record, really interested me. And in fact, many of my courses here at William & Mary focused on this idea of enlightenment and recognition of history, bringing history to the fullest extent possible to the public. In my class titled Decolonizing the Art Museum, we collectively wrote a paper assessing the art museums of colonial Williamsburg and its display and interpretation in light of decolonial considerations. In History of Family in Early America, we explored themes ranging from the relationship between family and state, changing concepts of disability or ability, gender and sexuality, and race and citizenship. What I have discovered in these courses is that, particularly regarding archival silences, is there has significantly been a lack of not only interest in surfacing particular documentation, and this is perhaps because of the difficulty in reviewing it, but also a disregard for it. As Dorothy Berry writes, these gaps in the historical record preserved by the archives are real and not accidental. Archivists have made decisions over time about who or what is deemed important enough to be preserved, and these decisions have influenced the historical record. Here at the lab, we hope to restore this record through meaningful collaboration. Yet, in each of these courses and my time at the lab, as students of history, we are faced with the great difficulty of analyzing archival violence, an archive that delivers a reason for the deeply rooted division and exclusion that persists within today's society. To turn one's head at this language and discovery is to do a disservice. Moreover, from such silences of those not given an opportunity to speak, we can nonetheless construct a researched picture, such as the project like Adam and Fanny's World completes. Thus, as Jennifer Morgan writes, to engage fully and openly with the aftermath of enslavement, with the problems of the past, and with its silences and reverberations in this moment in time feels not just compelling, but crucial. The names of the children at the Bray School may only be mentioned in passing, without being given the opportunity to speak for themselves within our archive, but the Bray School Partnership is working to uncover and share these stories to the public with the central goals of inclusivity and transparency. With inclusivity and transparency, contested spaces do not have to be as such. But from its very conception, the Bray School and subsequent project are and will continue to remain contested spaces by those who fear our past. Moreover, as a lab partner particularly tasked with transcribing various primary documents with association to the Bray School and their associates, I read firsthand arguments set forth by those opposed to the continuous education of almost 400 students from 1760 to 1774. This is a story interwoven with racism and violence, and it will continue to be contested by some from being told as interpreted as a dark shadow on the history of the grand United States, instead of as a complicated pillar of our nation that needs explanation. For instance, although the students of the Bray School were taught instruction that stood by the ties of enslavement, the education and curriculum they received was also rather liberating in its content knowledge. Although this is our interpretation of the Bray School, as a secondary educator teaching English literature now to students, I have found that outside the William and Mary classroom walls, a different culture surrounding education and enlightenment exists. There is immense pushback against the teaching of truth. Canonical texts are being banned from classrooms for their language and content. As we watch a thick black veil drawn over our history, it shields our nation's children from the truth that they need to understand in order to heal and progress together. I hope as a member of this lab and the greater community, I can continue to be enlightened and enlighten those in my very classroom and beyond. Contested spaces can spark conversations and inspire, but contested spaces can also cause further division when not properly addressed. In Cultivating Genius, we learn that criticality is the capacity to read, write, and think in ways of understanding power, privilege, social justice, oppression, particularly for those populations that have been historically marginalized in the world. Empathy is the essence of what it means to be human. This is why we must not just be non-racist, non-oppressive, but also work with passion and diligence to actively disrupt oppression in and outside the classroom. Simple good intentions are not enough, which is why criticality in my classroom is central to my teaching and my pedagogy. What we are doing at the Bray School Lab is disruptive and disruptive to the greater community, and it is contested by some. Simply walking my dog down Duke of Gloucester Street, I encountered a man, and he told me what a shame it was to see William and Mary become so quote-unquote woke. And yet we as a community at the Bray School Lab work and preserve to illuminate history despite its past and present challengers. Thank you.
I don't know how I'm going to second that. So I want to start by reintroducing myself. My name is Nicole Brown. I am a PhD student. I am the graduate lab assistant at the Bray School Lab, and I am just so humbled and delighted to be with three incredible students. So what I'm going to talk about today hopefully will complement all of the things they're going to discuss. I'm going to be specifically looking at the Bray archives as contested space. And so sort of in the same way that Madeline explained what does contestation or contested space actually mean, I want to talk about archives. So if you will, for a minute, indulge me, close your eyes. When you close your eyes, think of your favorite thing to talk about, your favorite thing to study, to research, to share. And then think about that one document, you know the one, that you wish you had, that would really highlight your point, if only it existed. Okay, open your eyes. I think we've all probably encountered that before. If I just had this one source, if I just could find this one thing. And you're not alone in that, but also all archives are that way. And so when we're talking about what makes an archive, we can talk about, is it primary sources? Is it physical objects? Is it buildings? Is it oral histories? Yes, it's all of those things. But archives also are imperfect. And I love this quote by Leslie Harris from her article, Imperfect Archives and the Historical Imagination, in which she says, there is no perfect archive, where every historical question is answered clearly and without the need for interpretation and imagination. There are only more or less difficult archives. And I always love to start with this because I actually think it's very freeing. Rather than letting a dominant narrative say, oh, you just don't have enough, or we just can't find enough to talk about these Bray School students, let's flip the narrative and say, what do we have? And how can we explore within the confines, not just of those archives, but thinking about them in different ways? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. One of the things when we talk about archives, though, is we also have to talk about power. And this is a book that I know the students who I work with hear me talk about ad infinitum, but it is a wonderful book written by a Haitian theorist and historian called Michel Roth-Trouillot, called Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. And he talks about all the different stages of silence in an archive, intentional and unintentional. So a good example would be, have any of us, we've all written an email or a letter before, yeah? And if you were to write everything in your head in that email or letter, it would be 300 pages long. So you self-select when you begin to create a source. But then there are other stages of silence along the way. Who chooses to collect those sources? Do those sources survive because you're wealthy enough and you're powerful enough, or you're deemed, quote unquote, important enough? So when we're talking about anything when it comes to the Bray School, we have to address that imbalance in the archives that exist and are extant. Simultaneously, though, that shouldn't limit us. And so one of the things that the students and I as a student wanted to do today, we all really like visual exercises. So I'm actually going to take a theory that I learned in graduate school and try to make it tangible. Marissa J. Fuentes wrote a wonderful book called Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence, and the Archive. And it's all about Barbadian women, but she's talking much bigger than that. She uses that as a case study to talk about how you reclaim the lives of Black women within an archive that inherently is violent towards them. They are archived because they are deemed property. They are archived because physical violence is inflicted upon them. So how do you bring out their ingenuity and their strength, both because of the archive and despite? And so she makes a recommendation in any primary source you address called looking at the bias grain. So how many of you have worked with textiles before? Some of you? A little bit? It's okay if you haven't. I'm going to walk you through it. So what you have here is a tablecloth. It's a piece of linen. Linen was very common in the 18th century in Williamsburg. Almost every single Black woman who lived here in Williamsburg would at some point in their lives had had linen on their body or be expected to manufacture something out of linen. And with any fabric, and I'm going to pass it around, you've got a warp and a weft. So a warp and a weft. That's how the fabric is woven together. And that warp and the weft, if you take it on a diagonal rather than along the straight grain, you see maybe where I'm going with this metaphor? If you take it along the diagonal and read between the warp and the weft, that makes the tensile strength stronger. So let's apply that to documents. So if you hold it up against the light, you'll be able to see the warp and the weft. And if you want to pass it around and pull it, just make sure you pass it on with people. Again, I think you see where maybe I'm going with this metaphor. There's strength in challenging the positionalities of documents. If you read straight along the warp or the weft, the literal, this is what is in the document, this is what it says, and refuse to address the positionality of the document, you might miss something that's really key to understanding a marginalized voice. So what I'm going to do within my section, how I'm going to finish it out, is actually have us apply archival silence and power and the bias grain in real time with a document that we know the Bray School students had. So this is a letter. It's actually a textbook that we know was used at the Williamsburg Bray School. It's called A Letter to an American Planter from His Friend in London. Basically, the Bray Associates started getting correspondence back from all their trustees across Philadelphia, Williamsburg, New York, and they started writing a textbook to be sent back in response to what they were hearing in these classrooms. I should also note that the largest number of copies of any one of these textbooks was sent to Williamsburg in 1771 to be handed out in Bruton Parish. So some of you might be verbal learners or kinesthetic learners. I'm trying to meet all learning styles here. But for those of you who are auditory learners, I'm going to just read out the bolded parts. It says, I proposed that you should have your slaves instructed in the Christian religion as the best mean to reconcile them to their state of servitude, rendering it more easy and supportable to them. It is the natural effect of such instruction to turn the eye service of slaves into the conscientious diligence of servants. So let's start with power and production in archives. If we were to just look at this document and try to understand power, what are you seeing? Quick thoughts with this document. Any thoughts? Yeah, Rachel. Yeah.
Because it's specifically coming from the Church of England, there's a lot of power in religion in this time period. So there's that intersection.
Yeah, so there's power in the sense of why this was even saved to begin with. It is a document that was published by the official church of the British Empire. So copies are going to be saved in an archive that might be different than an individual person writing them out. Any other thoughts?
Indoctrination.
Yeah.
Change them from savages to religious people.
Yeah, so the bias of the document saying we have to change them from savages to people, we want to indoctrinate them. These are all great points, and you have to look at these first when you look at a document, but you don't have to stop there. So let's take that bias grain theory a little bit further. So again, if I read just along the document, it's we want to make them complacent, we want to make them servile. But if I stretch it, this is a propaganda piece. Yeah, you see it too, don't you, Mr. Gardner? Because if this were actually already happening, why would they have to publish a text and send it 11 years into the school running to Williamsburg in the largest quantity anywhere in the British Empire? So you see how these two different theories can apply. Yeah.
Just because they sent it doesn't mean they used it.
That's another good point,
Okay?
too.
And like laws being reactionary rather than pro-action, something like this is a reaction to what's happening.
Yes.
It is reactionary, not pro-action. The same thing happened 100 years before with indigenous people in New England in trying to make them Christian as well. The same kind of thinking is that all we have to do is talk to them more, and surely they will see the light.
Right. So you're all making these amazing points off of a primary source that we know is in the collection of the Bray Associates. And I think this is the power of understanding archives as contested spaces. If we take the documents at face value and aren't willing to be critical with them, we miss large portions of the story that we could share. It's also why different types of sources are important: genealogy, descendant community. This is a photo actually from Descendant Outreach Week of this last year. But what I'm going to leave you with is a challenge as well, which is that we don't just consume archives, we create them. So in the next 25 years, what will everyone in this room create as it relates to the Bray School archive and the Bray School students that shifts the narrative? So with that, I'm going to leave it with Rachel.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Rachel. I'm a senior history major at William & Mary, and I've been in the Bray School lab for several years now, and it's really been a privilege. And I also work in Cologne Williamsburg as an intern, and that'll come into my presentation a bit. That's where all the hands-on textile work comes in. So the title of my bit of the presentation is Stitching in Contention, Bray School Sewing Literacy as Contested Space. And I know that's a lot of words, but what we're going to do is we're going to zero in even more to one particular line in the records that we have of the Bray School to think about this wider picture of how the female students specifically, what their experience looked like, and what we can understand of their labor, and kind of what is happening in their wider lives based on that information that they're learning within the Bray School. That's what we're going to work with. All right, so this is a letter that you're actually going to see again later in this presentation from Olivia. So even saying how much you can get out of even just one piece of paper. And so this letter is essentially listing out the school rules. So laying out exactly what's going to happen in the Bray School, or well, exactly what they want to happen in the Bray School. And so what we see that says time rendering the females more useful to their owners by instructing them in sewing, knitting, and etc. And another letter says such other things. I would love to know exactly what those things mean, but we'll break down what we can surmise and what we can say is pretty sure what those other things are. The thing that I want to focus on with that word of sewing is that maybe in our modern sense, what that looks like is just basic learning sewing, just start to finish, you've never picked up a needle before. I actually think it's a little bit deeper than that. Because what we know in the 18th century was pretty much base level for everyone in the 18th century is that everyone learns how to sew as kind of their basic chores that you learn as a kid. So this is both a skill that both boys and girls are going to learn. So then what sets apart that learning that the specific female students are doing within the Bray School? So already, if you're an 18th century person reading this letter, you know that sewing doesn't just mean picking up a needle for the first time. It means something beyond that. So they're doing something that, unfortunately, is set out to be more useful for their owners. So that means that it's going to be labor that is skilled, is going to be done within the households they're going back to. And they're also going to be doing knitting, and we'll get to why that might be important a little bit later in this. And then those such other things are basically anything else, in my mind, that fits into that sewing and knitting and textile craft and skilled labor that may be required of the place that they are. So that can mean a lot of things, and it can mean things like clear starching, like taking care of clothing, laundry. And these are very skilled ways to deal with textiles. This is very different than just kind of sewing straight on a sewing machine. All right, so we've got our source. That's what we're working with. So then what does this look like in reality? What can we do with this and put it into tangible information, even with one line? So something we've been discussing a lot in the Bray School Lab is samplers. And the idea of a sampler is that basically in the 18th century, the left one is a really pretty example, that we actually know was done by a Bray School student in the Philadelphia school. So a little bit later than the Williamsburg Bray School time period, but we know it was done by a black girl learning at that school in 1793. The one on the right, can you remind me who Mary Johnson is, Nicole? Because I know that you know far more about these samplers than I do.
Yes, so this is, according to Kim Ivey, who is the textile curator at Colonial Williamsburg, the best comparative example they have in their collection of what would have been a pretty standard, not just Virginia sampler, but Williamsburg sampler. So samplers are very specific to region. So Mary Johnson was just a young white girl who we happen to have one of her samplers from Williamsburg.
And in my opinion, I think Mary De Silver did a much better job on hers. Mary Johnson's a little bit of a mess, but what we're learning through looking at these are tangible objects that someone put their hands to in the 18th century. Is one on the right is Mary Johnson's, this is a learning process. This is maybe that first time that you do pick up a sampler. It's gonna look like this. But I think it's really important that Mary De Silver is as perfect as it is. This means that there is a meditative process going into learning every single one of those stitches. And then we have to think about her world and the fact that there's a lot more challenges in that world than maybe in Mary Johnson's. Mary Johnson can afford to make mistakes on her sampler. Mary De Silver and then her contemporaries in the Williamsburg Bray School do not have that freedom. And so that can even be what we see in just the tangible stitches of just two samplers. So Mary Johnson's is pretty basic, and what we're seeing on it is different letters. I think she has a few numbers on there as well. What you're doing with the sampler is you're learning that more explicitly skilled type of sewing, so not just your basic mending that everybody's learning when they're like 5. And you're also learning your letters and your numbers. You're learning how to write scripture, but you're writing scripture in a way where you are thinking about that verse for hours and hours at a time, because by the time you finish that one verse, or in Mary De Silver's, it's kind of like from a poem, so it's a quote from a poem, you're thinking about every single word of that more than you would be thinking about if you're just reading straight through a book. So when we think about literacy, when we think about what the female Bray School students are learning, they're learning that literacy, that reading, and kind of ciphering that we see coming up in the other instruction, but they're also learning something that means that they're gonna have to sit with those words over and over again. And it's going to involve, the prick of needles against their fingers. So that's kind of a different, expansive version of their education. That's a different way to think about the hands-on part of what it means to learn in a school that is both trying to teach you religion, but also trying to indoctrinate you and also teaching you something that is showing how much of a skilled person you are, but also saying this labor that you were spending hours and hours on is not for your own good. So that's what we have for samplers. And so this is something that we can pretty much prove, even though it's maybe not written in that exact letter. This is the type of work that would make sense if we're trying to think about literacy and learning and sewing all within that one half sentence in that letter. So I hope that helps kind of visualize what that sewing, knitting, and other such things might look like. And so this brings me to what we do even beyond just the textiles and the tangible things that we have from the 18th century. In Jennifer Morgan, which has already been cited, but she is a fantastic author in kind of working through the complexity of what it means to study gender and enslavement in kind of this wider Atlantic world. And so what she says is that the silences in the records are evidence of an irrecoverable whole. These histories are often a search for surrogates, an effort to find stand-ins for the missing voices of those enslaved, dead, and forgotten. What we do in the Bray School Lab is constantly searching for those surrogates. We are trying to fill in those missing voices, and that actually involves a lot of creativity. It's really easy to take an archival source that gives you all those answers, though as Nicole spoke about, not every archive is ever going to give you all the answers you want. But there are archives that are easier to get all the answers that you want from. But I like a challenge. And so an archive that's not giving me all the answers, it pushes me to use creativity and to use methods and theories that might not necessarily apply to everything, but they're gonna push my creativity. They're gonna push me to be challenged as a historian. So what does it look like for us to search for those surrogates? So the next slide I'm going to talk at length about, but it's a project that's really special to me because it's what I did in kind of a case study to figure out what does it mean to find a surrogate for information that we don't have. And so this little drawstring bag here, so that is sitting in the Colonial Williamsburg milliner and mantua making trade shop, which is where I work as an intern. And this is a drawstring bag that in the 18th century would have been referred to as a work bag. This is ubiquitous across all class levels. Basically, any woman that was doing a sewing project probably had one of these with her, because it means you just kind of throw all of your sewing stuff in it. They can be big enough to carry the whole project you're working on. And they're things that we see pop up in all kinds of print culture, as well as, really fancy ones that survive in museums. And it also pops up in an instruction manual in 1789 for a charity school in London. So it's not a school for enslaved and free black children like the Williamsburg Bray School. But the rules within that instruction booklet are really similar in their language to what's happening at the Bray School. So basically it says, this is all the fabric that you need to cut out, this is all the supplies that you need to buy if you're gonna give essentially donations to a charity school for them to do labor. Sewing labor specifically, basically to make their own clothing. But then there's one little page that says, and if a girl has finished her first pair of stockings, if she's done knitting, there's that word again, that was in our first letter. If she's finished knitting her first pair of stockings, then we'll give her a work bag as reward, and it will be a half-yard piece of red wool. It will have tape, which tape meaning just the string that it's holding together. It will have tape out of the same color, and it will have a piece of white linen tacked onto it, inked with the name of the girl as her prize. We cannot at all say that this is the type of work bags that the Bray School students were walking around with. But I can tell you that if they had to put their sewing tools somewhere, it would be in this or it would be in their pockets that were attached to their skirts. But what this does do is it means that I can put a Bray School student's name on something that is not a silencing archive. And so I can make that caveat. I can say, I can't tell you that a red wool work bag walked into the Bray School every single day with a student, but I can say that this is an object that you can touch that lets me expand out on this world and tell you about these students and tell you about the skilled labor that they did. Knowing that the very same stitches that I put into this bag are still the same stitches that they were learning. That's pretty clear in the record. And so this is what it means to find surrogates. So surrogates are, if we think about just the idea of a surrogate, we're finding the most useful way to transport that information in a way that's going to make it clear and bring back justice to that archive. And so that's where this kind of comes into interpretation. How can we hand people a tangible way to understand these stories that holds meaning, that is not indifferent from that meaning from the archive itself? And so that is the work that I have been able to do. And just kind of one more way to kind of, in the middle of this room, present that tangibility. Nicole has very gratefully brought in a shift. So a shift is that linen that Nicole was holding up earlier. This is it made into a garment. A shift is basically like a t-shirt shaped garment that any woman in the 18th century would be wearing. So literally any woman that you saw in the 18th century, that's the first thing that's touching her skin. Mm-hmm. This one is stitched with initials and a number. So can everyone see the really tiny blue stitching on that? It's very small because it's very detailed. It's done by one of our colleagues who is far better at stitching than I think I will ever be. And she just did a simple stitch that doesn't look the same necessarily on the back. It does almost look the same on the back because she's really good. But essentially, this is how you kept track of your laundry in the 18th century. And specifically how you kept track of your laundry that would usually be going out to a black woman, often an enslaved woman who was trained in laundry, possibly those such other things, so that skilled labor could be done by someone outside the household, and then that laundry is brought back in to whoever has given it. And basically, it ends up with initials and a letter on it because you got to keep track of who's basically underwear is whose. And so what we're looking at is that's just a simple way to mark it. But then what we're learning on the samplers, what those students might have been learning on those samplers, is that that's a marking stitch. It's the same letters and numbers on the front as it is on the back. It is one of the most complicated stitches to learn because you are doing something that is precisely the same on the front and the back. It takes an incredible amount of time. And that is what we often see on shifts and on objects like this when they are in archives, is that we see that perfect marking stitch. That's literally a garment that is traveling throughout Williamsburg with that skilled labor of possibly a Bray School student specifically stitched onto it. So that's what that tangibly might have looked like, and these objects and these garments that are moving around town that are constantly showing that regardless of the brokenness of the lives that these Bray School students are having to exist in, and the constant challenges that they're facing, their skilled labor is not hidden. It might be hidden in an archive today with the writings that we have, but when we start thinking about the tangible world that they're living in, their labor cannot be ignored. It shouldn't be happening in general, but it cannot be ignored, and it would not have been able to be hidden out of view in the lives of those people in Williamsburg. And so when we think about sewing, knitting, and such other things, that is the world that we're operating in. And that's how much you can get from one line if we're really willing to work along that bias grain and with creativity. So thank you.
Oh, hello. Hello, everyone. It is so nice to be here with you today. And though I feel like the baby of the group, let me just say it is a privilege and honor to be speaking with you all today. And so I will be talking to you about faith and education as a contentious space. So when I first started out with the Bray School, what I thought I was going to be looking at was more of like the trades they were doing there, the people who were coming in, the numbers of people and where they sent them, who they were, who were their owners, what they were doing for them, and things of that nature. But what I didn't think I would be doing was getting so much into the religious aspect of the school itself. I know that it had said that it was a part of an Anglican education, but I had thought it would be a little bit more in the background and not much of a mainstay as we've seen today, you know. And so as I first started my work for about like 2 or 3 months now, I've seen that religion was all within the educational space of the Bray School. Not only do you have reverends and clergymen writing to the Bray Associates, talking about the prayer books or the Bibles that they need in stock, which I will pass around for you. This is a replica of the 18th century versions of the prayer books and the Bibles you would see in that space at that time. You can pass them around. Yes, sir. But you can also see that religious education, or as I would like to call re-education, was a prominent display for the core of what they were trying to do. And so of the 3 letters that I've been working on so far, there are 2 instances that really stand out to me in terms of how they valued the people they were working with, the paternalism that they displayed during their correspondence with the Bray Associates, and I would like to read them to you. The first one is from James Mayer, and an interesting quote of his is in talking about educating these enslaved persons. You must understand there are great quantities of these Negroes imported here yearly from Africa who have languages peculiar to themselves, who are here many years before they understand English, and great numbers there are that never do understand it well enough to reap any benefit from what is said in the church, which was my reason for mentioning, as I did in some former letter, that the distributing religious tracts to the owners would be a more probable way of success, as those being wrote in the most plain intelligible style, they might by their owners be made in time to understand what was said to them. But you must suppose it to be impossible for me to go from house to house, to instruct 1,000 Negroes perhaps or more, some of which would take 1 week to make them understand one single scripture. And then the next one that I find really interesting is the one that I've been working on as of late, which is Jonathan Boucher to, to the Bray Associates. And Jonathan Boucher was not only a preacher figure, but a private tutor for George Washington's stepchildren. So he's working on both like a religious and educational front. And in talking about giving a service to the enslaved population, about more so 1,000 people on Pentecost Sunday, he says this: having but a weak voice, but a few could hear me, and fewer still could understand me. And this reminds me to ask you whether in such cases you think a man may be allowed in a few not absolutely essential particulars to differ from the forms directed by the rubric. Of the 300 and odd Negroes that day baptized, perhaps it would hardly have been possible to have found 3 capable of understanding in the manner required either the nature or end of the sacrament. Was I not then excusable in using words more level to their capabilities and exacting promises from them better adapted to their circumstances than if I had confined myself to the form prescribed? And then later in the letter, he also says that the same people who are not very capable in understanding what he's trying to say are responding regularly to the sermons, are attending regularly, and are responding to what's said with regularity and propriety. And on Christmas, he saw 15 who were very worthy communicants. Now, in reflecting on the letter, I've had a bunch of questions, like what is the original form he's talking about, the promises that he's offering them, and the physical comprehension and the mental comprehension, and the differences between those two. But the main thing that I see here is that there are contradictions in how he values their understanding of the religious material. So what I think of is that on one hand, you're going to the Bray School here to learn trades that are suitable for your owners, that are complex and involve complex forms and techniques. But then again, you're not intelligent enough to understand the Word of God or faith in general, you know. And if you have to explain something in such a way that dumbs things down or make it suit their capabilities in such a manner that dilutes the actual text or the perfect nature of the ends of the sacraments, are you really explaining things correctly? Is the message that you want being portrayed? What are you trying to get here? Are you trying to show them the statements of faith, the core doctrines, or are you just trying to get them in there to fill a quota, to get your numbers up? So, in looking at the letter, I see not only paternalism, but the ignorance and pride hidden within how he talks about them. And it's like you're explaining things, you think you're explaining things so correctly that in the end you've explained nothing at all. It may have not even reached the goal that you wanted to with the enslaved population. And with this, there is an air of condescension that takes away not only the voice, but the respect of the Black population. And my one question to this is, as a member of the clergy or the congregation, and trying to, what I would say, fulfill a very special role in the community, what are your intentions? Why do you want to do something like this? What does conversion do for your population? Is it a special kind of mode in order to form a connection with God or get in touch with one's spirituality? Or is it another method of control, as we've seen all throughout this context? So, but even there, oh, yes. Another thing that I've seen too is that, as we've seen in controlling people, there is a dangerous and impolitic to enlarge the understanding of Negroes. And they also say that we think are eerily founded. On the contrary, religion has a probable and direct tendency to reform their manners. So again, we see the controlling aspect of what they're trying to bring into the Bray School, not only through religious education, but through the trades that they're trying to employ through them too. But even within this religious context, that dignity that they take away from them is found in other forms of interpreting the text, particularly the Bible itself. And in preparing for this panel, I decided to look at this article called Read Through the Bible, Slave Education in Early Virginia by Antonio T. Bly. And it talks about how a group in 1723 was writing to the newly appointed Bishop of London in order to find hopes of freedom and education. And in doing so, they used religious imagery. And they even called themselves the children of Israel. And in writing to him in order to plead for their freedom and trying to gain this education, not only of the Bible, but of the various trades they can learn through the literacy in the Bible, Antonio T. Bly states that, indeed, by signing, the slave authors of the anonymous letter would have registered in print an ugly, distasteful, unthinkable fact, that unspeakable thing being that they too belonged to the human race. They too held themselves within their breasts the same natural rights their masters claimed for themselves. Perhaps most important, although they were sable sons and daughters of Christ, they too inherited the promise of Christendom and therefore birthed spiritual and earthly freedom. Denying slaves the full promise of Christianity represented but one of a series of regulations slave owners used to deprive their prized possessions of their very personhood. So in this, we can see that they are more than just a quota to fill. And seeing the Bible itself, we can go back to what Nicole says about imagining the text, looking through the archives to see different ways of resistance, and in this term, religious resistance. In looking at the Bible, we see not only practical, but spiritual means of getting up from bondage, So not only through education, but seeing themselves as people worthy of respect, personhood, and that's something that an owner could not take away from them. You can also see here, in terms of trying to feed a certain interpretation of what they wanted of the Bible, the Bray School associates. I talked about how one of the people, James Mayer, had said that it would take them about a week to learn just one sentence of what they were trying to say of these pamphlets and tracts. But I want to try to offer to you, maybe there was some type of willful resistance there that we're not seeing there as well. What if they weren't trying to learn about this education as an act of resisting the type of knowledge that they were trying to feed them? What if they knew something more that they weren't telling them, that they saw in these different sermons, like with Gowan pamphlet, which was one of the enslaved preachers here, who were telling them about the freedom that they could have in the Bible, in their spheres of influence, not just what their owners were telling them. And you also have to think about the different faiths that were practiced in secret as well. even though the Bible and Christianity at that time was a major influence in colonial Williamsburg and in all of the early America, you do have records of people practicing religions that they've brought from their home countries and taking it here, from cowrie shells that represent fertility, or different divination symbols, or artifacts with bowls trying to interpret the future, prophecy, and things of that nature. We can tell that Christianity was not the only game in town. Even though it wasn't the biggest game, there were still people holding on to the things that they had from their homelands. They did not come they did not come empty-headed. They had knowledge from the past, and they intended on using that, whether it was a mode of resistance or as a mode to communicate with their communities and reflect on the past as well. And in thinking of all of this and reflecting on this, I think that if we acknowledge the excellence of these students hidden within the text and recognize and respond to the dignity that they had, the dignity that their owners did not give them, that the people that wrote about them condescended towards them and thought of them as not worthy of knowing more than a trade suitable for their owners, we can build bridges for all types of connections. If you've been in Williamsburg long enough, you know that there is ongoing archaeological work around the area with First Baptist Church, figuring out the grave sites there, and shedding light on a not really talked about part of this history, or just CW in general, colonial Williamsburg. These histories are not separate from each other. They all connect. And as a student, especially a student of color, I want to try to build bridges between what I see here in the record and what I can do to help students and people from all over engage, you know. In the kind of bridges we build, I can see maybe why is there a disconnect between things like the white church or the black church, or why that's even a thing, you know. Martin Luther King says that the most segregated hour in America is at 11 o'clock during church, you know, and wondering and reflecting on why that is may lead to links to past separations or modes of worship that weren't accepted by the white majority, you know. And also continuing thinking about the students in CW. When I go down, you know, Dog Street as well, on many of an occasion, I am the only person there that looks like me, that isn't a worker or an interpreter of some sort. And I don't want it to be that way anymore. Whenever I talk to students at William & Mary, or whenever there is an event in that area, there is a sense of not feeling appreciated, or like we don't belong here, or that we're excluded from the nature of everything that's going on. But the truth is, we have just as much claim to that space as anybody else there, you know? And we've always have. It's never been talked about. And I want to be able to find connections and ways to engage the students in the population to try to bring everybody there, to not only bring dignity to those who weren't talked about, but to reveal the hidden histories of the past, of the Bray School, of the colonial Williamsburg area in general. And though I haven't done much, I plan on doing a lot. So, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I've definitely felt the same way in some kind of aspects. There are a lot of things, particularly with the history of the church in this country, that in terms of faith would make you want to like do a double take, like, why am I doing this, or do I even believe in this, you know? But, just in spite of that, seeing that maybe even the church could have, even if they didn't see everything that the people in charge saw, they still saw the church as a meeting space or a community space in order to still find power and resistance with despite everything, using that community to know that even though everything around us is messed up, we still have each other. I think there's a power in that. Even if you weren't necessarily going for faith reasons or because you believed in it, I think finding community in that space was a freedom in itself, you know, that, yeah.
I think about that a lot for me because I worship at the same church that held people in bondage. I am Protestant Episcopalian, and I see the communion cup we have and know that the Black little boys and girls who went to the Bray School were not allowed to drink out of it. And I think what's really powerful about this conversation and about this panel, who again I am so humbled to be around such brilliant women, is how these kinds of conversations lead to this kind of conversation, right? And talking about contested space in its best form leads to listening, I think. So I'm just really appreciative for what you've shared, Mrs. Gardner, because it's really made me think, and I'm just very appreciative for that.
I just had a quick thought. I had a thought. I'll stand so I can see you. Thinking about this, my question to the panel is, do you think that, or is there potential that had the Bray Associates been a Catholic organization rather than an Anglican organization, that the history of the Bray School would have been different? Because I'm thinking about Protestantism versus Catholicism and how Africans who were forced into the trade and were brought to the Americas found synergy with Catholicism, particularly the use of different Catholic symbols and practices that were complementary to their own practices, and were able to graft their religion onto the Catholic religion and do two things: preserve more, I think, than under the Protestantism that was forced and that we see in places like Williamsburg predominantly, but also allowed those things to be carriers for the extension and persistence of African religion and world religious systems, let me just call it that. So do you think that there's any difference between the history as it might have been written under a Catholic versus an Anglican church?
I do. Does anyone else want to go first? You sure? Okay. Oh, I'm sure. So I definitely have thoughts on this. I think yes and no. I think, obviously yes, because any colonial exchange, any colonial encounter of violence that also is conflicted and connected to faith is going to have different outcomes for those communities, right? And I think in particular, there's one book I always refer to. It's called Mastering Christianity. What a great title. That's all about the Church of England's attempt to dominate Black communities and Black communities' resistance to that writ large across the Atlantic world. So I think yes and no. You have a church and you have an empire that are so aggressively stringent of it will be done this way. We have a book, you do that book, you don't say anything different than that book, right? And I think the cosmology and how signs and symbols are or are not used in high or low Protestant Episcopalian or Anglican churches is very different. But I also think that sometimes that means that community subversion goes underground in a different way. The Bray Associates would not have ended up in Virginia if it hadn't been for the Baptists, right? And if it hadn't been for the Presbyterians, and if it hadn't been for Samuel Davies in Hanover County preaching and speaking and using oral modalities rather than cosmological modalities. Literally, the Bray schools are a response to the Baptists and the Presbyterians coming in through that first Great Awakening. And they're pretty frank about it in not so much their Williamsburg correspondence, but sort of their own internal correspondence. So yes, I think it would be different, but I also don't think that means, I don't want to imply, and I don't think it is true, that Black communities in the Protestant Atlantic world didn't reshape and reform Protestantism in the process. But I think it's different. It's a good question, though, Maureen. You guys want to?
It's not necessarily an expansive thought, but that does make me think of like free peoples of color in Louisiana and the big Catholic populations there. I haven't done much research into it, but that would be something that I would like to look into, you know.
I always talk about that with James Ingram, who
Yeah.
portrays Gowan Pamphlet. He's like, Nicole, you got to look at those Jesuit schools. You got to look at the Jesuit schools in Louisiana. And so I also think your question's a good one, Maureen, because it leads to another question, which is, how can the Bray School Lab better look at those differences and support the community, the descendant community, in the kinds of questions they may have? Right? Because there's what I might be interested in as Nicole, but I'd want to ask with the descendant community, what are questions you want to see asked, right?
Oh, knitting. I haven't done any knitting, so I can't talk about the tangible aspect of it. But I can say this is that in the 18th century, when we're thinking about knitting, we're not thinking about the really big knitting needles that we're thinking about today. So what we're looking at is really you only see knitting when you're making stockings, because it's kind of only the way to make socks in the 18th century. And you're looking at needles that are incredibly thin, like insanely thin. And you basically make like a box with 4 needles, and that's how you make stockings. And so when I think about like the girls at that charity school back in England, and I think about the girls in the Bray School who are knitting, the idea of just making 1 pair of stockings, I think, does merit a reward as a work bag, because that is an insane project. And so thinking about the fact that the Williamsburg Bray School students likely weren't given an award when they finished that first pair of stockings, but considering that type of work, as complicated as it was, would have taken a lot of time. So it's a very different way of knitting, and at this point you don't really have they're kind of working on like knitting frames and like more mechanized knitting, but it is really something that has to be done by hand. Yeah.
Yeah, so if I can add to that as well, the level of skilled dexterity, hand dexterity, to do the kind of knitting that these girls would be expected to do is unbelievable. I have a lot of friends who are professional knitters who are like, I would never attempt to knit stockings in the way that these Black girls were asked to knit them, because it's too hard. It's literally too complicated. But the other thing is you have to be very good at counting, because if you drop a stitch, it is going to ruin the entire set of stockings. So you have to be really good at arithmetic. And I think it's, again, that hidden layer in the text. They don't say, oh, we're teaching arithmetic. But you cannot knit these kinds of stockings and not have really good, actually, not just ability at arithmetic, but mental math to keep it in your head, especially when you consider how high the stakes are. What might happen to you if you get it wrong, right? And if you're interested in learning more about knitting writ large, there are a lot of great sources, but the Williamsburg Foundation does have a couple of darning samplers in their collection that you can see online. They're a little bit later than this time period. Darning samplers don't really come in as models until the late 18th century, but there are some really good extant examples that can kind of allow you to think about that context. Yeah. Yeah. One of the... Yeah, I mean, they found a massive amount. And thimbles are kind of a funny tool. I don't know if you want to talk about them at all. Yeah.
Thimbles are something that it makes a lot of sense that the Bray School students would have been using them, because it is much easier to continue learning sewing in like a specific method if you're being taught, if you were first taught with that thimble. There's a lot of relearning that you have to do if you learn sewing and then start using a thimble, then have to figure out sewing again. So it would make a lot of sense that there would have been thimbles on their fingers in the Bray School.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm also hoping that Rachel and the millinery shop and I can look at is grades of needles. So not all needles are created equal in the 18th century. You have very, very fine needles, you have very, very fat needles, and they did find several different needles on the site. And so the archaeologists are actually hoping to work with the milliners at CW to learn, because sometimes you can tell from the grade of a needle what it's used for. Yeah.
Can you talk about thimbles, how thimbles are used, the benefit, just to put the dots really close together?
Yeah, okay, so they don't actually go on your thumb to make sure you're not getting pricked. They go on this finger, so your middle finger on your dominant hand, which for me is your right hand. And that is actually pushing the needle through the fabric. So if I'm sewing, it's gonna be, the thimble's gonna be on this finger, my needle's gonna be between these two fingers, and I'm basically using it to push the needle through really fast. These fingers will just get calluses from the needle hitting them. And after a while, it doesn't hurt anymore, which is kind of scary to think about, but yeah.
I'm old enough.
So I now only sew by hand. I didn't know any hand sewing before I started doing the kind of research I'm doing. And one of the reasons was because I wanted to understand the value of Black women's labor, right? And I will say with a thimble, when you sew with it, there are two things that come to my mind with the thimbles that were found on this site that I have questions about. One, how do these thimbles express individuality of individual Black girls? Because I'm so picky about my thimbles. So I had to relearn how to sew. And once I did, the thimble creates a rhythm. So if you're doing a whip stitch on, let's say, I've had to do hand-rolled silk gauze, like 30 yards of it before. And it looks like there's no hem on it. It's very fine, but once you learn. The thimble helps you make sure you keep the rhythm of the size of the stitches. So that way when you gather, it looks like there's no hem on this like fairy-like piece of fabric. But I have a very specific thimble that I like. And when it goes missing, I freak out. So I will run around the house and be like, where is my French thimble? Because with the size grade needle that I like, and it makes me think about labor and contested space, right? So were these girls required to use the thimbles handed to them, required to use the needles handed to them? Did they have a specific needle that they liked? Did they have a specific thimble that they liked? If these thimbles went missing, what happens for these girls? So I'm so glad that you bring this up, because I had to relearn how to sew, and I've learned a lot, and I know we're going to talk more about maybe sewing in the year of Bray. But I think there are a lot more questions for exploration too when it comes to individuality of students through these thimbles.
Just when Nicole said individuality, I think about the fact that if any of those thimbles are silver in the archaeological record, silver molds to your finger.
Yes.
And so we're talking about thimbles that would literally have been shaped by the people doing that labor. And so, yeah, talking about individuality down to literally the shape of the thimble. If they are different, that means a different person was using them, which means an individual life and an individual story.
Add something really quickly?
Sure.
So I want to actually, because I have a question for my fellow panelists, and something you said really struck me. I think, because I've been thinking a lot about what has my time at the lab taught me as a student. And one of the biggest takeaways I've ever gotten is that just because you can't answer a question ever doesn't mean you shouldn't ask it. And maybe let people sit in why you can't answer it. And I love that, we may not have an answer to a question, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't ask it rhetorically. And so I'm wondering for my fellow panelists, what is one of their takeaways from working at the lab, working with Maureen, working with me, that has sort of changed their approach on, as young professionals, how they understand history and how they understand the Bray School as a contested space?
I can briefly speak on this because I currently teach English to 12th and 10th graders. And just based on not only my experience as I spoke to previously at the lab here, but also just at William & Mary as the greater whole, thinking critically and asking questions is okay in my classroom, even if we cannot surmise an answer. And I encourage radical discussion, and I encourage that. I want to facilitate that we're currently reading Macbeth and tying that to identity and to contexts that are relevant to my students today is so important to me, and elevating those texts to something that the students genuinely want to speak on, which is what's happening within their communities and within the greater nation as a whole. So I want to encourage questions that can't be answered necessarily, but that's how we grow as students and lifelong learners.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Again, my work has taken some twists and turns in, in my experience, and I guess I'm still trying to figure out all the things that there is to know about the Bray School. But one thing that I'll definitely take into consideration is that the silence speaks volumes, and that the things that you cannot see or what they aren't telling you about a particular individual or the enslaved population can also take you into a different direction that gives them the respect and acknowledgments that they deserve, you know. So, yes. Even just considering, like, space in that, too. Like, not... When you go into CW, again, like, what places are considered and what places are not as looked at, you know, and why that may be. Why isn't there many people coming over to this space? What is it about this one particular place that isn't attracting people? Is it something about it? Is it something that they aren't saying? I think just considering what we cannot see is just as important as what we can see in the text.
I think one of the really big takeaways from my time in the lab is how important community and collaboration are. And not just community and collaboration in what they can help us and tell us about history, but the trust that comes into those relationships. So, like, when we are holding space for what descendants want to say, what they need for us to find out of this history, there's a level of trust there. People are trusting us with the history of their families, history that does affect all of us. But if you don't come into those spaces with a sense of trust and humility, it's going to go wrong really fast. And so I think my time in the lab has taught me a lot about where trust and humility come into that aspect of collaboration. And that if you're willing to collaborate, then you really have to be open to new theories and methodologies, and to trust that if those things tell anyone something new about the past that is important to them, then they are valid methodologies. If it teaches people something new and has truth built into it, then that's a valid way to look at history. Maybe that's not how we've always done it, but that doesn't mean that it's not any less valid.
I have just a quick question. So thinking about, the sewing and knitting, we see these words on the documents. And for some it might conjure, this is where we're bringing the contemporary ideas. Knitting now is something that is relaxing for many, not for everyone. It's much more common to go to a conference, to go to an event where someone in the audience is knitting.
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah.
Some students knit in class as a way to mitigate anxiety and other things. So, but I'm thinking about the repetitive nature of work. I'm thinking about the thimbles. So, quick way to get to my question is: do you think that is it possible that the sewing, particularly sewing needles and so on, that repetitive action, the nature of that work, and you mentioned calluses and so on, is it possible that learning that was done in the context of the Bray School around that had a negative effect? I'm thinking of dexterity. One of the reasons I don't like working with needles is because of what it does to my fingers. So could that learning of these skills in the Bray School have had a negative effect on the other aspects of the children's lives, because they're kind of still feeling the effects of those, of that needlework in other spaces and other activities?
So I actually think you're asking a great question that I'd love for us to come back around with the Descendant panel and the Year of Bray, because sewing has so many different meanings to so many different people. I know this might sound weird, but I like the feeling of needles on my skin because it makes me realize where I'm physically at if I get overwhelmed. I'm like, okay, I'm here. I'm not out in the ether. But my experience as a white woman is going to be different than an experience as a young black enslaved girl.
I see it as drudge. I see it
Right,
as drudge
right.
labor.
And so I wonder, how can sewing and asking the community how we might see the methodology of sewing be used to either address drudgery or racial reconciliation? So there are a lot of textile material culture experts right now who are focusing on, including one who used to work at the millinery, sewing as a form of healing. So that repetitive nature allowing you to then talk with somebody who's sitting doing the same labor as you. So I wonder, to your point, Maureen, I think obviously your experience and feelings make complete sense. I wonder how we can pull this conversation out even further to the descendant community and say, are there things in the Year of Bray in 2024 with sewing that we can do to address drudgery and social justice?
So wonderful. So thank you to our panelists. We've got a little break. We reconvene at 11. Thank you so much. Thank you.